We have just a little bit to finish up with speech perception. Another thing that we pick up as we listen to speakers speak, as we listen to the speech stream, is information about speaker characteristics. So gender, age, whether the voice is familiar, dialect, all of that kind of information. One of the studies that has given us some bit of information about how we're picking up information about speaker characteristics is Palmieri, Goldinger, and Pisoni, 1993. So they had listeners, so they would listen to a list of words being said by a speaker, and then later they would have to identify which words were old and which words were new. So they hear a new list of words, but with some old words mixed in there, and they were more rapid. They more rapidly identified a word as old on a list that they had heard before if it was repeated by the same speaker. So it looks like listeners are taking in two levels of information about a word as they're listening: its meaning and the characteristics of the speaker's voice. This shows a certain amount of bottom-up processing, right? That we are processing the exact acoustic signal, that when we hear the word signal said by me, that later you're going to recognize that more rapidly said by me, signal, than said by somebody else, because you've taken in that information from a bottom-up kind of way. And of course, we always have top-down processing as well, especially as I've been saying, how much we're listening to context in order to figure out what these speech sounds are and to figure out what people mean. So we know the meanings of words, we have sentences, the context that we've talked about, knowledge of rules and grammar, the background knowledge of the speaker. All of this is going on as we are listening to someone speak. I have already talked about a couple of brain regions that are involved as we're listening to people talk. One is the superior temporal sulcus, as we are imagining to some extent, if you will, the movement of the mouth, and then also the fusiform face area if we are familiar with the speaker, if we know the person who is talking at that moment. The other areas, so the areas that we usually talk about as being involved with speech perception and with language in general, are Wernicke's area, which I'm going to talk about as the mental lexicon, of where we really hold the meanings of the words that we know, and Broca's area. And if you'll notice, this is up in the frontal lobe, on the left frontal lobe in the left hemisphere, and just in front of our motor cortices. So again, that brain was showing Broca's area and Wernicke's area as two of the probably more commonly discussed regions of the brain that are involved with speaking and speech. Broca's area was discovered by Pierre-Paul Broca. He was working with people who had this kind of aphasia back in 1860, and so this was a time when there weren't any good ways to look at brain activity or a brain in a live human, and so he would work with someone who had this kind of aphasia, and then they would die, and he would go in and do an autopsy and see where there was damage. And probably the most famous of people that he worked with was a guy named Tan, who was named that for the fact that he really could only say the word tan, and he could understand what people were saying to him. He could follow instructions, but verbally, the only thing he could really say was tan. And he had that after the autopsy. Broca could see that damage in the frontal lobe there at Broca's area, and of course, this was clearly very profound damage, because there are. So I have a link there that I'm going to include in Blackboard that I do think. So I usually show it for somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes, depending on how behind we are. So you can watch for a little while and kind of get an idea of what this kind of Broca's aphasia sounds like. And clearly, Sarah Scott, the woman in the video, is not nearly as severely damaged as Tan was. And I will just go ahead and say, so I'm going to do things out of order a little bit here, because I have always stopped this and showed it, and we talked about it. So I'm hoping you will pause this and go watch that and come back. But I'm going to go ahead and act. So I'm going to kind of act like you've done that. And I usually ask people, so what do you notice about Sarah Scott? And I'm going to tell you some of what I hear. So one, that she is, she knows what she wants to say is what it looks like. It kind of looks like she's having this tip of the tongue effect, like she knows what she wants to say. It looks kind of laborious. It looks frustrating. You might notice that the grammatical markers are often gone, unless it's some short phrase. I can't remember what she says. I haven't watched that recently, but she'd say something like "it seems like," or something. She has some phrases that were all put together, but a lot of times she's leaving out the determiners and the helping verbs and all the kind of grammar. So that's often really gone. And she is understanding. So her mother's asking her questions, and she is understanding her mother. They typically do understand unless there is some specific kind of ambiguity where the word order is very important and maybe non-canonical. So I think your author gives the example of the apple was eaten by the girl. So that passive sentence, they understand that, but the boy was pushed by the girl. That passive sentence, they don't so much understand, because usually our agents at the beginning, the boy would be pushing the girl, but because it's a passive sentence, the boy was pushed by the girl. That was and by, those are the grammatical markers, and they tend to not really be able to process those, or they're not using those correctly. So that's Broca's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia, again, in the temporal lobe. As I said, it's our mental lexicon. So I'm going to read from a different textbook. So your author does have an example now, but I like this one because it has more non-words in it. So I'm just going to go ahead and share this one from Ashcraft and Radvansky. The experimenter is asking the patient about what was his work before hospitalization, and this is the patient's response. I want to tell you this happened when happened he rent. His kell come down here, and he got rent something. It happened. And these ropeliers were with him for his friend, like was. And he rode in all of these arrangin from the pedis on from is pesid. Okay, so there was some nice non. So I have a link in there I'm going to skip. It's has that woman has another couple of problems or issues going on, and the sound is there's a sound problem with it that's it grates on my nerves, so I'm just gonna not include that link. But this is in the PowerPoints if you want to go watch a woman who's, it's clear that she doesn't really understand the questions from her responses to the questions. And it was kind of clear in this one too that he's not talking about what he did before hospitalization. It's kind of hard to tell that because he's using gibberish words, but he's talking about something that happened. And when he gets to that point of, and he wrote in all of these arrangin, not arranging, that's a weird word, on the pedis, from his pesid, that he's speaking gibberish. And so I usually ask people what they notice about the Wernicke's aphasia, and I try to read that relatively quickly because oftentimes they are speaking quite quickly, like they know what they're saying. They are actually pretty convinced that they know what they're saying, but they're not comprehending other people. That mental lexicon is really damaged, and so the appropriate words are not coming out of their mouths. And I talk about it as they're kind of talking gibberish. They're really not making sense. In addition to not understanding what other people are saying. And that area of the brain was discovered by Carl Wernicke. As we've now seen for vision and for hearing, for more general hearing, that after we leave the primary receiving area, that information is going really along two separate streams. We also have a dual stream model of speech perception, where coming from the more anterior or the more frontal part of the auditory cortex and going down and into the frontal lobes, through the temporal and frontal lobes, is where we're going to recognize speech. And your author has some great pictures of activation of specific neurons in response to specific speech sounds. So recognizing those speech sounds. And then coming from the posterior, so the farther back part of the primary auditory cortex, and going up through the parietal lobes and into those motor areas, we see our other stream, which we might think of as where processing, but it's different here as it's getting to the production of those acoustic signals, the motor movements we would make if we were producing the speech. And while it does appear, so there was a motor theory of speech perception saying that we are using those motor areas in order to understand speech, while it does look like we don't need those motor areas to help us to understand speech, but that there is this link, and that they do help us to understand speech as well. And in my very last piece, I sometimes leave out the development piece, but showing this real experience-dependent plasticity of when we are babies. So young infants in all cultures are capable of distinguishing between all of the possible speech sounds. And it's really going to be what they're exposed to that they are eventually going to be able to distinguish. And those sounds that do not make a phonemic difference in our language, we're going to stop being able to hear those sounds. That happens by the age of 1. So he has this, I think it's Kuhl et al., Patricia Kuhl and her colleagues in 2014, this is from 2000, where they are looking at American infants and looking at Japanese infants at around 8 months old and around 12 months old. And at 8 months old, the la, ra, so they're habituating to something like ra, 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 hearing that over and over again. And then they switch to la. And at 8 months old, American infants and Japanese infants, they both groups of infants hear that difference, can perceive that difference. But by the time they are 12 months old, if I remember correctly in another study, it looks like right around 11 months old, the Japanese infants are hearing that distinction less well, so they're not dishabituating when they hear the change from ra to la or la to ra. And as we know, that l, r sound is something that a lot of Japanese people have difficulty with because it's not a phonemic. This doesn't make any meaningful use in their language. Whereas the American infants by 12 months old in this study, they are getting better at hearing that, at perceiving the difference between ra and la, because it is a meaningful difference in our language. And he has this great quote by Patricia Kuhl. Oh, I wanted to find it so badly. That has that's something like, oh, here it is, that young infants are citizens of the world because they really are capable of learning any language at that point. So I'm going to finish up with my coming back to these questions, and I'm going to end out basically answering them. Sometimes some of these questions are ones that there's kind of a real answer to, and sometimes we get into good discussions though, and that's just going to have to be not done this semester. So if we get to how do we know where words begin and end? If you remember, the speech segmentation is there's 40% of our silence is, or less than 40% of our silences actually are between words. And so segmenting speech can be particularly difficult. And we saw that if we don't know the language, if we don't know the words of the language, it is really difficult. We really have to know the words of the language. We're using the meaningfulness of words to help us figure out where they begin and end. How do we handle differences within and between speakers? So if you remember, some of this is really a bit about categorical perception, but a lot of it comes back again to meaning and top-down processing and using our knowledge of what people are saying in order to hear these differences in speech sounds, that sometimes we create these sounds differently from each other and we're still able to hear them as we need to. If we ask what is a speech sound and how do we recognize it, well, a speech sound is we're really talking about phonemes here again, those smallest unit of sound that makes a meaningful difference in our language. And as I feel like I come back to the same answers, because there's a lot of top-down processing in speech, and the understanding of the words, using grammar and syntax that we saw, having context, all of that is helping us to recognize these speech sounds. And again, the categorical perception helps a great deal as well, that things that are getting close to that boundary, we're gonna fit everything into d versus t, and there's not going to be a kind of there's not a point in there where we're saying, oh, I'm not sure which category that belongs to. So we get this really categorical perception. Okay, with the Sarah Scott and so forth, I'm going to call this about half of the class this time, and I'm going to get started with touch.